Hello, everyone, and welcome to this brief module titled the CSACI Summer Studentship Applicant Training Module. CSACI is the Canadian Society of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today. My name is Jennifer Proger. I am the Endowed Research Chair in Allergy, Asthma, and the Environment, and an Associate Professor at the University of Manitoba. I'm also a research scientist at the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba. I'm presenting this on behalf of myself, as well as Dr. Moshe Ben-Shoshan, who is a pediatric allergist and associate professor at McGill University. We are the co-leads of the CSACI Research Pillar platform. There are two learning objectives for this module. The first of which is by the end of this module, the learner should appreciate the various components of a summer studentship research proposal. And then second, to gain understanding of the CSACI Summer Studentship scoring system. And we've designed this module to help you with your application process for the Summer Studentship Program. And so let's roll right into the first learning objective. I do want to first make a comment about the applications, however, that the review committee has been instructed to not consider incomplete applications, incorrectly formatted applications, and we'll work through those formatting guidelines over the course of this module. They will also not consider any applications that are missing required signatures. So please plan in advance. Don't leave these types of activities until the last minute. We also require this year a checklist, and so please do make sure to include a completed checklist with your application. And it's also worth mentioning that any applications received after the deadline will not be considered, and there are no exceptions to this deadline. I mentioned formatting in the previous slide, and this is a really important piece. This particular application requires that all documents be prepared with 0.75-inch margins, and this is on letter size pages with a font of Calibri 11 point. This is important when we consider the length of the application. The application itself is no more than a total of 2 pages. Over the course of those 2 pages, the research proposal needs to include a number of different sections, and we'll work through these over the course of this module. And they need to be numbered and presented in the following order. So background, overarching aim and specific objectives, methods, anticipated results, potential limitations and mitigation strategies, knowledge translation, EDI or equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations, clinical relevance, as well as conclusions. We do have a requirement also for tables and figures. These may be included in somewhat smaller point font. However, they do need to be legible at 100% zoom on a laptop. So do make sure that the text is large enough for somebody to read without having to increase the viewing of the page. I do also want to note that although the types of tables and figures you decide to include, there is some discretion within that. However, each application must include 2 things. 1, a Gantt diagram or a timeline, and second, an image of the study design. When submitting the application, all files must be compiled into a single PDF, and this must be done in the order outlined in the checklist. So let's roll in then to the structure of the proposal. And as mentioned, I'll work through each of these individually to give you some guidance on what is expected. The first section I'd like to talk about is the background. This is a section in which candidates, applicants will often provide a lot of information. When preparing an application, though, especially one that is very brief, such as a couple of pages, there is a real need to be concise. The background should contain enough information that a reader who has some knowledge in the field of allergy will have enough familiarity after having read the background to be able to understand the proposal. So in this brief studentship application, the background is actually going to be quite short. But within that very short text, again, a need to be concise. But we also need to make sure that there are references. So a well-referenced background is really important. There also needs to be consideration as to the type of information that's included. Is everything in that background relevant, or does it contain any unnecessary information? There's a need also to consider the literature that's cited. So is it supportive? Does it enhance the statements? And is that literature recent? Typically, when we think about recent literature, we think about the last 5 to 7 years. That's not to say you can't have older citations, but do try to keep them current wherever current literature exists. You may also wish to refer to previous publications from the team to which you're applying, for which you're hoping to get funding. This often strengthens the application. And if there are any preliminary results, you might mention them here, but there's also a separate section where they could be also placed. So the background again, concise, up-to-date references, and only containing the necessary information. At the very end of the introduction or the background, there's a space for a knowledge gap. From there, the overarching aim and specific objectives should flow naturally. Here, we want to make sure that the aim and the objectives are both clear and attainable. Are they written in plain enough language that a reader with a background in allergy or immunology could understand what is meant? And are they realistic? Can this actually be done over the course of one summer? So when writing objectives, think about, is it possible? Does it flow logically that you will be able to complete this project over the course of one summer? Will you gain expertise, experience, and knowledge that will serve you well in your careers? And that, thinking about what kind of contribution will you make to the research over the course of the summer? So all of those things should inform the aim and the objectives. And when you're writing an aim, be very explicit. Say something like, the overarching aim of the study is, and then write the overarching aim. And then the specific objectives of the study are, and you can list them by number. The specific objectives of the study are to 1, and then 2, and then 3. That will help keep your reader really focused on keeping everything organized. The more clearly an application is laid out, the easier an application is to follow, and that tends to make it easier to assess. If a reader is looking at your application and is considering what are the strengths of the application, grants personship is one of the things that they will consider. So I'll come back to this a little bit more as I get into learning objective 2, but really, again, thinking about being as laying things out as clearly as you can. So that begins with a clear background. We've just talked about the aim. And again, I want to reemphasize that, be really explicit. The overarching aim of the study is, and then fill in the blank, and the same thing for the specific objectives. This type of language will serve you well, not only in your studentship applications, but as you go forward with any type of manuscript writing. After the aims and objectives, we then move on to the methods section. And this is where I'll spend a bit more time talking about methods, because there are certain things that we really do want to consider in this section. The methods section should be built around each specific objective. So you started with that overarching aim, then specific objectives. You may have different methods for different objectives. That's okay, but parcel them out so that the methods follow with the specific objective. If you only have one specific objective, that's entirely okay, but spend more time then talking about the types of methods that you're going to be using for that particular specific objective. Again, remember that the types of studies that are more likely to be favorably received are those that can be completed within the course of the summer. So if you have a couple of specific objectives and the data are already collected, that's entirely possible. But if you're starting off with brand new data collection and data analysis, you might want to think carefully about how many specific objectives you actually do include in your proposal. Within each specific objective, it's important to elaborate on the techniques and the timelines. How are you going to do a data analysis? thinking about, if it's a basic sciences project, are you going to use an ELISA? If you're using population health, are you going to be using, where are you going to be getting your data? Are they already collected? What types of methods are you going to be using? Is it a randomized controlled trial? Talk about those types of things, talk about study design. If it's a qualitative project, that's fine too, but think about, what kinds of techniques and timelines you might have for that type of project. I mentioned study design a moment ago. And I want to emphasize again here that it's crucial to use an appropriate study design to attain the aims of the study that will really minimize the risk of bias. And if it's a quantitative project, also to allow for adjustment of potential confounders. So study design refers to the overarching design of a project. Is it a qualitative study? And if so, what type of qualitative study? Is it an interview? Is it how many people are you collecting data from? Is it a randomized controlled trial? Is it a population study design? Is it a basic sciences model? And if so, what type of design are you using? It's at that point when you're thinking about study design that you really do need to work with your proposed supervisor to think about the types of resources that might be available or references that might be useful for you to help design the methods, but then also to write the statistical analyses so that you have more rigorous results. One piece that I do want to mention, and that is for all of the applications that are quantitative, thinking about any type of bias, any type of systematic error in the design, the conduct, or the analysis of the study. We can also think about this a little bit in qualitative work, but the way we think about it is slightly different. Again, speak with your supervisor for more details. But bias refers to any systematic error in the design, conduct, or analysis of the study. And what I mean by that is, any errors, whether they be incorrect assessments or a lack of internal validity. There are always risks of bias in any study design. Here we've included 3 different types of resources that may be useful to you. There are certainly many, many more available. Again, write this section in partnership with your supervisor. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about 3 different types of bias. And here I want to emphasize that these are not an exhaustive list. They are just to get you thinking about the types of things that you might want to consider. We talk about first differential misclassification bias. And this is when the misclassification, such as a disease type, is different in between the 2 groups that are going to be compared. So it might be a difference between a case and a control in a case control study. And here the estimate would be either biased in one direction toward the null or away from the null. So differential misclassification, there's a difference between the groups. The other is non-differential misclassification bias. And as that name would imply, this is when the misclassification is the same across the groups that are being compared. So for example, if an exposure is equally misclassified in the cases, as it is equally likely to be misclassified in the controls, then we think that's more non-differential misclassification bias. And it's in this case that if there are, if it's a binary variable, then the estimate is biased toward the null. The last thing I want to mention on this slide is external validity. And when we think about external validity, we're thinking about the meaning of generalization of the results observed in one population to another. And then really there's no external validity without internal validity. And while these types of bias may not be relevant to everybody who's doing different types of study designs, it's something that I do want to encourage you to think about, whether they be bias in this sense or other forms of bias. And to that end, we've also listed some additional resources for you on the screen. So we've touched on the background, we've touched on the objectives and aims, we've touched a bit on the methods. The next thing that I'd like to speak with you about is the anticipated results. Anticipated results are not a required section, but when they are available, please do include them as they may help strengthen the study or the application. They can help support the study that has been conducted, saying to justify, provide further evidence that this is an actual study that can be done over the course of one summer. On this slide, I've also re-mentioned figures and tables. Again, you don't need figures and tables in this section, in the results section, although typically when we think about a manuscript, for example, or a thesis, that's where most tables and figures are. Again, not necessary in this section. You may include them as long as they're within that page count. The figures and tables that you must include, again, just to reinforce, these are a Gantt diagram, and this is included because we believe that it will help both the supervisor and the student stay on track. And then an image of the study design. And the reason we've asked for that is that going forward, when you think about knowledge translation at a presentation or even in a forthcoming manuscript from this work, that type of image or figure will be useful for you. Moving then on to section 5, that section is potential limitations and mitigation strategies. Every study has some type of limitation. When we think about limitations, so we want to think about them in terms of transparency. How transparent were these described? So if you had a small sample size, say it. If you had difficulty with recruitment, that's okay, but be transparent about it. Be humble in your interpretation of the findings, and then also in terms of how you think about your limitations. Again, recognizing that every study will have some type of limitation. There is no such thing as a perfect study. But what I would also encourage you though to think about is not only saying, you know, we had a really low number of people in the study, but we did everything we could to address this limitation. So on that end, when you think about potential limitations, we have to acknowledge that not only should those limitations be discussed in terms of their transparency and their humbleness, but also thinking about how you navigate those limitations. So, you know, think about, we had a small sample size. However, we took these measures to increase the number of recruits. So these are the methods we used, of course, all approved by your research ethics board. But we did our due diligence in trying to make sure that we had large enough numbers. Or you could say, despite these findings, they are novel or they reinforce what was previously described in the literature, thinking really carefully about how you navigate them and trying to reframe them in a way that there is a lesson taken away from it. The other thing that you'll want to consider is why, despite these limitations, a study is nonetheless important. So despite the small number of participants that were in this study, our findings are novel, or we are the first group to report on this, something to those effects. Really think critically about what why the study is important. And here again, work with your proposed supervisor to understand those potential limitations and how to mitigate them. The next piece I'd like to speak with you about is knowledge translation. And this is a piece that is increasingly recognized for those of us who are applying for grants, because there is a need to not keep research in silos anymore, but actually to share the findings. So knowledge translation at its core involves sharing the research findings. CIHR talks about, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research talks about knowledge translations being a complex set of activities involving advanced knowledge generated from research so that it informs effective change in either policy or practice. So it's a benefit to the community that it's intended to serve. This is too brief of a module to go into all of the details of knowledge translation. However, I would strongly encourage you to go on the CIHR website, the link is there for you, to really understand knowledge translation and to gain more insight into what a detailed knowledge translation or KT project proposal might look like. But broadly speaking, there are two different types of knowledge translation. The first type is integrated knowledge translation, or IKT. As the name suggests, this is a type of knowledge translation that occurs over the course of the project or over the life of the grant, if you will. And it requires that those who are going to use the knowledge, so whether they be patient partners or decision makers or those who are involved in practice, are part of the research team. These individuals are involved in the generation of study materials. They are involved in the generation of anything that goes forward to participants. There are controls, they provide insight rather to help make sure that the language that's being used is appropriate. And they become very much part of the research team, not only in the creation of study materials, but in the interpretation of the results. So while they may not provide guidance on the actual statistical analysis, they may inform how the data are interpreted, what those findings mean. In brief, integrated knowledge translation is when members of the research team are active all the way through the research process. This is an increasingly popular way to do research. It touches on patient engagement all the way through and patient partnership. More commonly, however, still is end of grant knowledge translation. End of grant KT requires that applicants submit a plan for how they want to use their findings afterwards. And this is a more classical way of sharing research findings. It might involve a conference presentation once all of the data analysis has been done, all of the research findings have been interpreted. But the process itself is, the research process is complete, and this is more a delivery of information rather than integration of knowledge sharing all the way through the life of the grant. There are benefits and pros and cons to both types of knowledge translation. One is not necessarily better than the other, but do think of how knowledge translation can enhance your particular project. The next piece I'd like to touch on is equity, diversity, or inclusion. You may have heard this referred to as EDI. There are some different expressions to talk about the same thing. Some people describe DEI. Sometimes abbreviations include JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. What we're talking about here is consideration to depending on what your research question is, but differences by ethnic groups. Have you considered different groups that this could be applicable to? Have you considered sex and gender? You know, and in every application we think of, well, is there text that relates to biological sex? How is the variable of biological sex going to be integrated into the analysis? And if not, why not? And likewise, how has gender, which is a socially derived construct, been considered in this type of application? Will it be considered as a variable at the various stages of the research process? And if not, why not? So a brief text on that. Other ways you might want to consider this. So we touched on ethnicity, we touched on sex and gender. Depending on the type of study that you're doing, there may be a discussion around indigeneity. It depends on the research question that you're asking, but there needs to be some type of consideration to EDI. Ideally, this is also considered in the construction of the team, recognizing though, of course, that as a summer student, you may be applying with a team that is partially or fully constructed already, that you don't have as much opportunity to think about EDI considerations when you're joining a team rather than constructing it from scratch. I do want to take a moment and touch on clinical relevance as well, thinking about how the findings from your work will have any clinical relevance. Here, we need the applicants to think very broadly, very constructively, and very futuristically. So what do the findings mean? Again, as I talked about in the KT section, we talked about how research findings can't be siloed. Research findings are intended to benefit society, whether that be at a clinical sense or through policy or through practice. For your summer studentship applications, think about what the relevance is to the work that you're doing. You may want to really lean on your supervisor for this, but again, think big picture. If you find that this particular drug seems to work very well in a mouse model, what are the downstream clinical relevant applications for this particular finding? Think very broadly, and don't be afraid to think outside the box. This is more downstream effects. The last item here, and I've incorrectly noted this as number 8, but it should in fact read number 9, is the conclusion. A conclusion is brief. Conclusion should be about 2 to 3 sentences, and ideally would be in alignment. The language of the conclusion would be in alignment with the language in the overarching aim and specific objectives. Let's say, for example, you in your aim wrote, the overarching aim of this project was to establish the prevalence of food allergy in Canada. In the conclusion, your conclusion might be something to the effect of, in conclusion, we found that the prevalence of food allergy in Canada was 7%, and the estimates were comparable across the country and between boys and girls, between males and females. That's an example of a conclusion. So do keep that type of language in mind when you're writing it. You'll note again that the language of the conclusion was brief and the language aligned with the aim and the specific objectives. So that was learning objective number 1. I now want to just take a few moments and talk about learning objective 2. Learning objective 2, again, was to gain an understanding of the CSACI Summer Studentship scoring system. On the next slide, I'm going to show you the scoring system. This is the rubric that has been provided, that will be provided to all reviewers. And so in the name of transparency, we're providing it here as well. So the maximum possible scoring system, maximum possible score rather, for this particular competition is 50. You can see within there that we have 4 different categories. There are, the first of which is the academic and scholarly achievement. What is the applicant's academic and scholarly achievement? And we are specifically telling reviewers to base that on the applicant's level of training. So we're not comparing the applicant who is just completing who's completing their first year or second year of undergraduate to somebody who is well through completing their 4th year medical school and has a previous degree. We're comparing like with like based on reviewers' experience of having evaluated studentship applications for undergraduate students who are in their early years of training. How does this particular candidate rank? And the same thing for somebody who has additional years of training. They may be completing medical school. The example I gave was they came in with the previous degree. How does that person compare with that pool of candidates? So, trying to compare like with like here. We're not putting a very junior student up against somebody who has very more years of training. The majority of points, however, will be allocated to the research project. So again, this is a piece that I've just spent the first learning objective was addressing, really thinking about that proposal, thinking about, starting early, working with your proposed supervisor to write this application. Don't leave this until the last minute. These are applications that are difficult to write. We're asking for a lot of information in a relatively, tight word limit or page limit. So do start early, refine, and don't be afraid to put it aside for a little bit. Come back to it and go back and forth between you as the applicant and with your proposed supervisor to make sure that the application is as strong as possible. We do want to touch on the benefit to the student. What is the benefit to the student for completing this work? What are the opportunities for the student for mentorship? Where is the mentorship training throughout the course of the program? And this might be through opportunities to be involved in knowledge translation or to learn a new data analysis method, to learn to write a manuscript. There are different ways that a student could benefit from a CSACI Summer Studentship, but they need to be articulated. And the last is some discretionary points. And this is where things like grants personship become really important. So how the application is laid out on the page, how clear an application is to read it. And again, so I hope that some of the points that I've mentioned throughout the course of this brief module have been useful for you. So thinking about how things appear on the page. Did applicants follow the rules or the guidelines for formatting? Did they follow them perfectly? Or are there variations? Sometimes common errors are common things that we see when we're looking at grant applications is the font that is used in a figure or a table is just way too small to read when it's at 100% zoom on a laptop. Or the margins are extended just a little bit because they're trying to maximize the amount of space, or that the font size isn't correct, or that the font is inconsistent. They may have started with Times New Roman, then it goes back to Calibri, and then it goes back to Times New Roman. Again, take time to really be consistent with not only the preparation, but the final polishing touches, the formatting of this type of application. In total, as I mentioned, the highest score possible is 50. I will say that for this type of competition, the maximum, the highest ranking applicants, the difference between the highest ranking applicants and those students who don't ultimately get funded tends to be quite narrow. So really think carefully about what you want to apply for in terms of the project. Work carefully with your supervisor, take time to write a strong application and one that reads well, is concise, is clear, but that also is set out very nicely, very elegantly on the paper so that it is clear to read, that the applicant or the reviewer rather can identify all of the necessary pieces of information and to make an informed decision as to the scoring system. So in conclusion, the careful preparation of a CSACI Summer Studentship application will improve the chances of success. That scoring range, again, from those who are funded to those who are ultimately not successful in this competition, can be quite narrow. So put your strongest application forward. And when doing that, consider the guidance herein, as well as the scoring rubric when preparing your application. Good luck to everyone. Thank you.